Chapter 11 The Weight of Moonlight. Jason quickly took the card Carl handed to him. Carl pointed at Jason with his face full of cupcake and started walking backward with eyes wide. Jason nodded and put the card in his breast pocket. "If I get her, I will call you immediately," Jason said, hanging up his phone. "Voicemail now, but I will keep trying." Carl made the OK sign with his right hand and turned to walk out. Lindsay said, watching Carl leave. "Is it legal for him to hand off his card like that?" She asked the question to the other two, but Jason was typing a text on his phone, so it was Tabitha who met her gaze. "Legitimate, yes. Legal? Maybe not," Tabitha said and sipped her tea. "Is this something he does regularly?" she asked, wondering how much trust Carl must have for Jason to allow himself to be so financially vulnerable. Tabitha smiled with the music, feeling the chord changes as though they were unlocking dusty doors in deep valleys of her once again free soul. She inhaled the steam permeating from her cup. "Not regularly, dear, but if needed, he does it." Jason looked up from his phone and placed it on the table. "And seeing as he and I are about to start living together, he knows that anything I would do to him would affect me." He looked at Lindsay. "If I mess up, I'm only hurting myself." Lindsay was still holding Tabitha's phone, which had completed its boot up, and she looked at the screen, noticing that it was an earlier model of her own phone, one from about 3 years earlier. Lindsay fiddled with the device in her hand, and Tabitha could see the girl wonder how the phone was still in working condition despite the usual lifespan of such delicate technology. The fact that Lindsay did not brazenly ask about it was a plus and a minus for her in Tabitha's appraisal. It was good that she was not so taken with the presence of technology in their current world that she would speak and possibly pass judgment on Tabitha for having the phone for so long, when the social norm dictated a new one every 2 years at most. Yet, if the girl was thinking about it and afraid to voice her question or opinion, it spoke to her lack of faith in her own self, which could be easily attributed to her youth or a general uncertainty generated by being the new person in a group of friends on a night as potent as this. Tabitha leaned over in the brief silence. "What's on your mind?" she asked the youth, fiddling with her phone. Lindsay looked to Tabitha and hesitated a moment, understanding any outward appearance she was quickly constructing was transparent to this woman with the magical, majestic vision. "Well, I don't know your passcode," and Jason placed his phone on the table and took Tabitha's phone out of Lindsay's hand to unlock it. She watched as Jason opened the phone. "Do you folks trust each other with everything?" "I didn't trust her to reset the passcode on her phone the last time she had me open it," Jason said, and then seamlessly segued to addressing Tabitha. "I can clear the notifications, but do you want the texts and voicemails deleted?" He looked at her, and she communicated voicelessly the pains she still felt and the dread of having the messages from Luke earlier in the night, which she would read and hear, hanging over her. She knew that given the chance, she would look through them while she was still vulnerable, and either second-guess herself or, worse, just let herself be hurt greater. Seeing this on her face and paying no mind that his reading of her was something Lindsay was equally stunned by, Jason answered his own question. "I will forward the messages to my phone and delete them off yours. And then, when you are ready, you just tell me and I will get them to you," he said, and set to the task he had just explained. "Thank you," Tabitha said, unburdened and grateful. She then turned her attention to Lindsay. "And to answer your question, Lindsay, If the best form of friendship is evident in trust, then discovering the connections by which to experience it is something, of course, we must. She sipped her tea, and as the cup descended from the contact with her lips, and the aroma hung low before her face, she added, "Do, or at least try to." I just did not know that such things like speaking in poetry were still practiced, Lindsay said. It's not poetry, Jason said, still looking at Tabitha's phone to transfer and erase the messages. It rhymes and it flourishes the air with rhythm. He looked up to them. But it ain't poetry. Oh, don't be such a snob, Tabitha instructed with a swaying of her upper body. Not everyone is as gifted in literary crafts as you are. She spoke to Lindsay as Jason continued with his task. Our prolific lunatic pulls together symbols and syllables with the kind of fervent madness of the metaphysical poets. She gently placed her cup on the saucer, which is why we need to keep an eye on him so he doesn't implode and die before he achieves fame. Lindsay put her hand on her teacup and looked at Jason. Tabitha wanted the silence to make it clear that her last statement was serious. When Lindsay looked back to her with a clear question on her mind, Tabitha smiled and let her eyes dive their gaze into Lindsay's teacup. "So, I'm wondering," the young girl said, "how do you still have the S2? And there it is," Tabitha thought regarding the subtext in the question. Lindsay detected it too, and, wishing she had chosen her words with greater care, removed her grip from the teacup momentarily. With her hands hovering around the liquid's vessel, she looked down to the table in front of her, and the posture made her self-consciousness apparent to Tabitha. "I don't mean, how could you ever be seen with that phone?" she said, nearly stumbling in her voicing of her point, like multiple punctuation marks crammed into too small of a space. I mean, she looked at Tabitha and was soothed by her calm and warm expression. "What did you do to make the phone last this long?" Tabitha looked at Lindsay's teacup, and the girl's hands enveloped it, lifting it to her lips while her eyes remained fixed on Tabitha. "I don't use the data capabilities, so I don't go online with it," Tabitha said. And the talk regarding modern technologies from such a timeless musical soul seemed strange to Lindsay for a moment. "And I also keep use of it to a minimum. Like anything else, the greater the amount of use, the more it is worn out, and the quicker it ceases in its primary function. Unless you are doing regular maintenance and customized upgrades," Jason added. "But most folks couldn't tell you how their phones function, much less how to keep the functioning of their phones at optimal levels." Jason placed Tabitha's phone on the table and slid it over to her. "Done. Just let me know when you want to look and or hear them." "Hey," Lindsay interjected, "could you imagine a sign on a door that says AN? And if anyone would get the joke." Jason and Tabitha looked at each other. Lindsay slowly looked from one to the other. When her eyes met Tabitha's and she sipped her tea, Tabitha looked at Jason. "I like her already," she said, and picked up her tea. "Then here is something serious," Lindsay stated. "If you have such great trust in each other, what keeps you all aiming your attentions and affection or desire for affection towards each other?" Tabitha was pointing at the stage and looking at Jason. "Is this 2 or 3?" she asked. "This is 3," Jason responded. Tabitha turned her attention toward Lindsay. "I am sorry, dear. I am not deflecting your question. In fact, I am so enamored with your presence that I am losing track of that upon which my attention should remain. She gently returned the cup to the saucer and began shifting her weight to stand. The short answer to your question is because there is so much to do in the world. She stood. The long answer, if you'd like, I can tell you once I get back. Tabitha made her way across the room to where the sign-up sheet and pen remained. She glanced back through the corner of her eye and saw Jason and Lindsay speaking close to each other. Whether it was to avoid being heard by others or not impose their voices on this ambient and hauntingly quiet final song from the current performer was not clear. The intimate nature of their discussion, however, as conveyed by their body language, was clear. And Tabitha felt sincere joy in seeing Jason's comfort with Lindsay. She reminded herself to ask them later how they had met. Reaching the location of the list, Tabitha noticed there were 2 more performers on the night. She looked around the room and felt some pride in seeing how many of the earlier performers were still in the venue. She made it a habit of telling performers at the start of each event that etiquette demanded that they not simply play and leave, but also stay to experience others' music. She could always tell that some folks simply had to leave early, but would make the effort to stay for the 1 or 2 acts that followed their own time on stage. For the most part, though, performers had taken to enjoying each other's music and would stay to offer moral and emotional support to each other, and that is the foundation of the pride Tabitha could feel from this moment, that the music scene she devoted her energy to cultivating was sprouting in a manner by which the participants were interdependent. With certainty in her purpose, she took a deep breath and let her sight deliberately coast across the room before landing again on the list. 2 more names at the bottom, 2 more 15-minute sets, unless one of them chose to shorten it, which was an option she always made clear. It is okay to run under your allotted time, but never accepted to run over, she had told the performers at the start of each night that she conducted on their behalf. She suddenly had recognition of her magic and understood what she could do, and indeed does, for the world. Her contribution seems magical only in so much as it is done with the earnest warmth of love rather than the calculating methods of commerce. This and other venues, these businesses driven by commerce, is where she was able to carve out brief periods of time in which the artistry of humankind could be displayed, developed, and appreciated. These events she hosted were expressions of the very center of that which commerce seeks to play upon, the human element, diverse and ingenuous, unified and stupid, ever varied in its expression, was here, and she was its herald, calling to the heart of humanity, beckoning to its kindness, and daring its dreamers to open their portents to the world and wrangle moments of insight, beauty, and infinite stretches of possibilities from nothingness to place them in the view of others. If oblivion is the perpetual threat of all humanity, Tabitha was one of those who stood devout against such threat by conjuring scenes of inspiration and artistry, cooperation and mutual respect, for those were the qualities that would always improve the chances that oblivion would never catch up to all of the human souls. And the soul of souls would perpetuate in defiance of nothingness, to be while it shall be, and be all of the variants of true beauty. This and all of the other scenes, each with multiple overlapping personas, that she orchestrated and pulled together. This was her calling, her sacred duty, and she would continue it as long as her body took breath, her mind spun thoughts, and her heart knew the joys and pains that delight and terrify until they are upon her. The music from the performers stirred such thoughts, and she was grateful to have been present to allow it to work its unique magic upon her. She began the applause to signal the room to join, and her appreciation was contagious, carried through the room until all knew the same. Albeit for less than a moment, the performer on stage felt like the lord of the universe in receipt of such admiration from the audience. Tabitha took the stage alongside him, speaking his name in her mellifluous manner, and directing him back into the crowd that gave him social love in the form of an ovation. She called the next performer to stage and led the person to the level of comfort needed to perform. She touched her shoulder gently and looked out to the crowd and quickly walked to the soundboard to ensure the levels for the young singer who was glancing to her father in the front row to stave off her nervousness, would make her sound as lovely as she looked. She also gave little glances to the regulars, who were 20-something-year-old males, as if to silently communicate for them to be on their best behavior as they took in the sight of the long-legged blonde girl on stage. She had a feeling that, polished in her performance or not, this singer would receive a good response from at least the portion of the audience that would want to see her more scantily clad than she currently was. Tabitha took some solace in that the girl's father was there as the best line of defense against the otherwise gentlemen. But she knew that someone would invariably try to talk her up after her set. She noticed a twinge of envy for the youth, and adjusted her levels on the soundboard to help the pretty image on stage sound as sweet as she could. I think boost the low end for her mic because she probably has a nasally voice, she heard from slightly behind her, and she turned to face the origin of the sound. A man, a little taller than her with shoulder-length hair, stood there looking at her. Thanks, she said. That's what I did. Great, he said. Glad you know your stuff. He extended his hand. You're Tabitha, right? She shook his hand and smiled. The hostess, he said in the silence. Yes. She was still shaking his hand and stopped, but didn't let go, and neither did he. I'm Justin. He seemed to be waiting for a reaction. The last name on the list, he revealed. Oh, Tabitha was a little taken aback by his face, long yet well sculpted, and holding oval eyeglasses in front of his brown eyes that looked like they had an orange or red hue swirling in them. Good to meet you, and thanks for staying around. She wondered why she was still holding his hand, but squeezed a little to emphasize her thanks for his having chosen to stay around. Well, thank you for keeping things running so smoothly that I can get up there before the night ends, he said, returning the squeeze and prolonging the handhold, which long since ceased to be a shake. Yes, I run a tight ship, which is why places like me hosting, she said with a smile. He looked at her, and only looked at her, and looked only at her. He quickly inhaled when he realized he was staring. You do this quite often, then? He asked. Yes, I'm one of the residing matriarchs of our local scene, she said with amusement, wondering in the next second if she sounded like she was bragging. She followed up by saying, I haven't seen you at any of my other events. Yeah, this is my first. He bobbed his head slightly, looking around the room. Well, my first here. I'm new to town. Been here only 3 weeks. Where are you coming from? She asked, thinking she seemed to be asking that question more and more these days. The D.C. area. Just outside, really, in Maryland, he responded. Well, what brings you here? She knew she would be asking that as she finished asking the previous question. Music, and he looked at her again. She liked that answer. Well, Justin from Maryland, this is the place for it, so glad to have you here. She gestured to the stage. When you get up there, you'll have 3 songs or 15 minutes, whichever comes first. Watch your watch, because if you start a 4-minute song with only 3 minutes left, you'll get on my bad side, and you don't want that, especially since all us hosts and booking agents confer with each other. In short, she looked at him squarely. You be respectful of your fellow musicians if you want to be respected. Clear? Yes, ma'am, he said, and shook her hand to show how impressed he was with her. She let go of his hand and turned to walk back to the table with a smile on her face. Wait, he called, and she turned around. Since I'm new in town and I'm trying to figure everything out, I was wondering if I could get your number. She pointed to the board on stage. My Facebook group is listed there. You can find all the events I host posted in that group, or you can message me if you have any questions. And she moved to turn away again as he stepped closer, tentative in his approach. Yeah, but he looked down as she turned to face him again, and he looked at her sheepishly. How likely am I to convince you to come and have a cup of coffee with me through there? He slightly squinted and lightly bit his lower lip. Tabitha smiled, flattered, and inhaled while she looked over her shoulder to Jason at the table, who was watching her with protective zeal and smiling as he heard whatever words Lindsay was softly speaking into his ear. Justin from Maryland, she said, turning her smiling head back to him. Are you trying to pick up the hostess? I'm trying to pick up the most beautiful woman in this room, he said, and matched her smile. Tabitha laughed, not at him, but because his boldness was so enticing that she wanted to give him a hug right there and then. She bit her lower lip and let it flip past her teeth. Honey, I'm a native, a daughter of the Republic of Texas. You come to 3 more of my events, you be respectful and you behave, and you can try again. She turned her body slowly and continued looking at him. Yes, ma'am, he said, with dignified hope upon his brow as he nodded once. She was surprised that her smile was accompanied by a wink as she turned away from him and sauntered back to the table. She noted that she did saunter. She walked with the fluid intent of accentuating the contours of her body. It had less to do with how she looked and more to do with how she felt about how she looked. Not about what she thought about how she looked, but how she looked like what she thought, and her thoughts placed her in the realm of smoldering sex, passionate embraces, and wonderfully wicked pleasures. When she noticed Jason smiling as she neared, and saw Lindsay with wide, unbelieving eyes on her draw nearer to Jason as though protecting him from the advancing, all powerful queen incarnation of Yin, she realized she achieved her intent and could scale it back a bit. Dropping her shoulders and sliding into the chair perpendicularly next to Lindsay, her warm, matronly smile appeared, and she picked up her teacup. "What was that?" Jason asked. Oh, the newcomer was flirting and didn't know what he had gotten himself into. She looked to her left and saw Justin still standing where he was, stunned and stupefied, and blissfully so, by what he had been given allowance to see a mere moment ago. When he realized her eyes were upon him, he jolted and smiled, and his right hand went over his heart. She tapped the back of her left wrist with her right index finger as though she were touching an invisible watch, and then pointed to the stage where the young girl was captivating the audience with a light country medley well suited to her voice. Justin, across the room, nodded and moved toward his guitar case at the back of the room to check tuning and prepare. "Can you teach me how to do that?" Lindsay asked. "You can learn it," Tabitha said with a sly smile, "but that can't be taught." She took a large gulp of her cooler tea and placed the cup back atop the saucer while continuing. "And you must have some thunder of your own to rattle our poet out of his self-imposed cage," she nodded to Jason. "And that reminds me," she said, looking from one to the other with her genuine curiosity, "how did you two meet?" Jason and Lindsay looked at each other. When she smiled at him, he felt his own smile occur and spoke first. "Well," he said, looking at Tabitha, "after dinner, I was driving home." "Wait," Tabitha cut him off without apology. "Dinner tonight?" He nodded. "You two just met tonight?" Lindsay looked at her too, and she and Jason both nodded in perfect syncopation. "What is going on with this night?" she asked the world more than she did of her present company. "The power of the reader?" Lindsay offered, and Tabitha looked at her. "Is that all that it is?" Tabitha asked, looking at Jason. "Is it that we talked about something at dinner that made us aware of the possible presence of the reader?" "Maybe the conversation called the reader to us," Jason said, "like a form of candomblé that calls down the orishas, the divine beings that mount humans and convey wisdom by their vision." He smiled. "But what we called down was a spirit of intellectual being, a universal intelligence, an awareness," Lindsay said. He looked at her. "A form of consciousness tailored to our needs in this circumstance. And because we are driven to our own being by our own volition and individuality, it doesn't mount us in the traditional sense, but is observing us. Because just by observing us, we feel its effect, and that is, in a sense, how we are mounted by it," Lindsay added, and Jason nodded. Tabitha did not discount what they had said, but was trying to, especially because they seemed to be of one mind at that moment. And that evidence to what they explained, something she hoped was lost to them, was very clear to her and frankly scared her. "So let's get this clear," she said, "and take the murk from the water. Our conversation was a form of adulation that pleased the universe in such a way that we called into being a spirit of awareness, called it to us, and now it is affecting us in our lives by knowing about each of us in ways that spurs us to improve the communication of our true selves to the world." She looked at Lindsay and inhaled, and then looked at Jason. "Is that about it?" "Sounds like the most obvious explanation to me," Jason said. "Yet I don't buy into the idea that there was something external to us that did it," Tabitha stated with skeptical certainty. "Well, then we are opening the door to the questions regarding what constitutes external or internal regarding our varied selves." Jason was not meaning to be antagonistic or oppositional. If we are more than what we can sense ourselves to be, perhaps we are the essence we are attributing to the reader. Or, to put it another way, Lindsay added, the reader is not the reader without us to read. Tabitha regarded the two with kind envy, for their ease of common communication, as though they were sharing one mind and communicating the thought held collectively, was emotive and portrayed an intimacy that she herself would have desired if not for her own inclination towards being her undiluted self, free from the influence of others. "I would think there might be a confluence between us and the reader," she spoke aloud, yet softly enough to not interrupt the music from the stage, which she could tell was coming near to a close. "A cascade of influence that flows both towards us from the reader, yet also towards the reader from us." "Makes sense," Lindsay said. "Why would the reader be reading us, if not to experience some sort of self-reflection visible in our adventures?" The last word she spoke was stirring, and Jason and Tabitha knew it. Looking at each other for a brief glance as the world washed over the conversation. Adventure was the best way to express what this night was for Tabitha, and she knew that was true for these two, and for Carl, who was in motion seeking Danny, and for Danny, too, who was the most likely person to be calling Jason's phone at this moment. Jason's phone was silent and vibrating with the incoming call. He was looking at Tabitha, and the phone was just outside of his peripheral vision, although it looked like it was moving in such a way that it was frantically trying to get his attention. For a moment, Tabitha considered that Carl was calling, but somehow knew it was Danny. Accepting that this would mean Jason might leave for more than the time it would take him to answer the call outside, as respect for the performers would dictate, Tabitha thought it nice that she would have time to spend with Lindsay, to get to know the girl who somehow managed to open the heart of their mad poet. "Danny's calling you," Tabitha ventured as a guess that seemed more certain than not, and Jason looked to his phone, his eyes moving with Lindsay's to view the device. As he lifted it and nodded, he looked to Tabitha, who turned her head to look at the youth and smiled, trying to cultivate the mutual comfort she knew they would both need for their coming conversation. "I will be right back," Jason said while standing and moving toward the door. He answered the call and spoke quietly while cupping his hand over his mouth so Danny could hear him at low volume. Tabitha watched Lindsay's gaze go from Jason to her as the performer finished and made it clear that that would be her last song. Amid the applause in the room, Tabitha stood up to switch the human portion of the staged spectacle, and Lindsay sat there content in how her night had unfolded. And Tabitha knew this girl's life had been as drastically altered as her own, and that they would use that as the starting point of the conversation when Tabitha would drive her home later tonight. Predictions such as those were common for her as she regained her self-certainty.